The year was 1945. Across the Pacific, the distant echoes of war still rumbled in the air, a haunting symphony of chaos and despair. On a small, rain-soaked island, the sun struggled to pierce through heavy, grey clouds, casting the world in a cold, unforgiving light. In a makeshift prisoner of war camp, lines of Japanese women, exhausted, trembling, and hollow-eyed, huddled together under the shadow of barbed wire. Their hands, callosed from months of deprivation, clutched threadbare clothing. Their faces, streaked with mud and tears, told stories of a suffering that words could barely touch. A tense silence hovered over the camp. Every footstep of the approaching soldiers sent shivers down their spines. Fear had become a constant companion, the spectre of death, a relentless shadow at the edge of every heartbeat. Some closed their eyes, bracing themselves for the inevitable, imagining the end as a merciful escape from the cruelty of hunger, exposure, and despair. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and distant gunfire, mingling with the metallic tang of tension and dread. And then, as if cutting through the thick veil of hopelessness, came words. Words spoken not in threat, but in mercy. The Americans, armed yet compassionate, addressed the trembling prisoners. A warmth, fragile yet undeniable, began to seep into the cold corners of the camp. Hearts that had long feared the finality of death felt a tremor of life returning, fragile as a candle flickering in the storm. In that moment, humanity pierced the relentless darkness of war, a single thread of mercy binding the fractured spirit of those who had already lost so much. As the first rays of a fragile, grey morning struggled to pierce the dense, storm-laden sky, the small prisoner of war camp lay cloaked in an almost suffocating stillness. The air was thick with the damp scent of mud and decay, mixed with the acrid tang of smoke from distant explosions. Every inch of the camp bore the weight of months of neglect and suffering. Splintered wooden platforms served as beds, tattered blankets provided barely any warmth, and the ground itself had become a quagmire under the relentless rain. The prisoners, Japanese women in their late teens to early 30s, had learned to navigate this harsh world with a strange, cautious rhythm. Their bodies and minds worn thin by starvation, exposure, and the ever-present threat of violence. Yet, even in this state of near-perpetual exhaustion, their spirits retained a fragile, flickering ember of life, hidden beneath layers of fear and despair. On this particular morning, the fear in the camp had taken on a new intensity. Rumors had spread among the prisoners that the American soldiers approaching the camp might not bring mercy this time. Whispers, hushed and urgent, wound their way through the rows of makeshift shelters, describing imagined horrors, painting vivid scenes of retribution that would leave no one untouched. The women, their faces pale and etched with suffering, instinctively lowered their heads, closing their eyes against the thought of what might come. Some gripped the damp, coarse blankets around their shoulders as if they could somehow shield themselves from the inevitable. Others pressed their hands to their chests, listening to the rapid, unsteady rhythm of their own hearts, counting the seconds until the next step, the next shout, the next act of violence. The very air seemed charged with anticipation, vibrating with tension that was almost tangible, a living thing that pressed down on them from all sides. As the soldiers drew closer, the prisoners' collective breath caught in their throats. Every footstep on the wet earth, every metallic click against rusted gates seemed amplified, resonating through the camp like a drumbeat heralding doom. Mothers clutched daughters, sisters clung to one another, and friends grasped hands with silent desperation, drawing what comfort they could from human contact alone. The women's eyes remained closed, eyelids fluttering as if trying to shield their souls from the horrors they feared, imagining that death might come quietly if they pretended it was already there. Some thought of the families they might never see again, husbands who would not know their fate, children who might never hear their voices. Memories of a life before the war, simple, unremarkable, yet profoundly precious, flooded their minds, mingling with the cruel reality of their present. And then, above the tension, above the drumbeat of fear and the roar of imagined violence, came a voice. It was neither loud nor commanding. It did not bark orders, nor did it shout warnings. It carried a calmness that seemed almost unnatural in the chaos of war, a careful precision in every syllable. At first, the prisoners could not discern what was being said. The words were drowned beneath the pounding of hearts, the wet slap of mud under boots, and the constant, haunting whisper of the wind through the barbed wire. But gradually the tone penetrated their fear, softening the edges of panic that had gripped them so completely. The Americans were speaking not to intimidate, but to reassure. The cadence of the speech, the gentleness in the delivery, carried a message that was astonishingly simple yet profound. You will not be harmed. Mercy has not abandoned you. For a long moment, disbelief and confusion battled against the prisoners' instinctual dread. They dared not believe that anyone, amidst the horrors of a world at war, could offer kindness, could extend a hand without cruelty attached. Slowly, hesitantly, eyelids began to twitch. Faces, previously locked in rigid expressions of fear, began to betray subtle signs of life, a raised brow, a trembling lip, a flicker of understanding in eyes that had been vacant for far too long. The sound of human voices, gentle, deliberate, and merciful, pierced through the dense fog of despair, reaching places in their hearts that they had believed were permanently numb. With each syllable, a strange alchemy took place. Fear, once a solid and immovable presence, began to shift, transforming into cautious curiosity, then to fragile hope. Some of the women dared to peek, slowly lifting their heads, scanning the figures of the soldiers approaching. What they saw was not an army of monsters, but human beings, clad in uniform, yes, armed and alert, yet moving with deliberate restraint. There were no aggressive gestures, no cruel smirks, no visible intent to harm. The soldiers' eyes, focused yet calm, conveyed empathy, a recognition of suffering that seemed almost incongruous in the midst of conflict. The prisoners could scarcely comprehend that such a thing could exist in this place, this time, this moment. Some pressed their faces to the mud-streaked earth once more, unable to fully trust the reality of what they were witnessing. Others, braver or perhaps more desperate, allowed themselves to meet the gaze of the Americans, searching for confirmation that the words they heard were true. Time seemed to stretch and warp as the prisoners wrestled with the collision of hope and terror. They had lived for months in a liminal space where death felt constant, almost companionable, and the idea of mercy had become alien, almost unthinkable. Memories of hunger, illness, and the relentless brutality of captivity surged through them, reminding them of everything they had endured and everything they had almost lost. And yet, in the voice of these soldiers, there was a promise that the world had not entirely abandoned them. The words carried a weight far greater than mere sound. They were a lifeline thrown across the chasm of despair, a fragile but unbreakable tether connecting the prisoners to the possibility of survival, to the faint but unmistakable warmth of human compassion. With each repetition of these carefully chosen words, a transformation began to take place. The prisoners, once rigid and immobilized by fear, started to breathe differently, slightly deeper, more regular, as if the voice had physically displaced some of the terror lodged in their chests. Fingers unclenched from blankets and each other. Shoulders, previously hunched and tense, began to relax. Small gestures, a hand brushing hair from a sodden face, a tentative glance toward the approaching soldiers, signaled that the women were starting to reclaim some fragment of agency in a situation that had stripped them of everything else. The tension that had gripped the camp so completely did not vanish, but it shifted, softened, and became permeable, allowing something almost magical to enter: hope. In that fragile moment, there was a sense of shared recognition between prisoner and captor. Neither side had spoken of it aloud, yet the unspoken truth was clear, even in the merciless machinery of war, even in a place designed to crush bodies and spirits alike. Human empathy could still pierce through. For the prisoners, it was a revelation that would etch itself into memory, the memory of a voice that refused to be cruel, that insisted on acknowledging their humanity when all else had denied it. And for the soldiers, it was a quiet affirmation that their actions, when tempered by compassion, could restore dignity even in the darkest corners of conflict. The rain continued to fall, slicking the mud beneath feet and washing streaks of despair from tear-streaked faces, yet the day felt different. A subtle, almost imperceptible light had entered the camp, not from the sky, but from within the prisoners themselves. They lifted their heads further now, not fully, but enough to see faces that reflected what they had dared to hope for: reassurance, safety, and mercy. Some wiped tears with trembling hands, unsure whether they were crying from relief, disbelief, or the sudden recognition of life's tenuous persistence. Mothers held children closer. Sisters found strength in each other's gaze, and friends allowed themselves to exhale, just a fraction, releasing some of the weight that had pressed on them for months. The moment, delicate and fleeting, contained multitudes. It was a collision of fear and hope, despair and mercy, death and life. It was the realization that, even in the heart of a merciless war, human kindness could emerge in the smallest gestures and simplest words. And as the soldiers continued their careful approach, speaking in calm, measured tones, the prisoners began to internalize a truth that they had almost forgotten: that survival was not only possible, but that the world could still hold moments of grace amid suffering. That grace, though fragile, was powerful enough to reach through the darkness of months, to ignite courage and resilience in hearts long thought broken. The women did not fully comprehend what the day would bring, nor could they know how long the mercy they were now witnessing would last. But for that brief, breathtaking instant, they dared to believe in something beyond the confines of fear. And in that belief, something extraordinary happened. A barrier dissolved, invisible but impenetrable no longer, between the captors and the captives. Mercy, once an abstract concept, became tangible. It was not a grand gesture, nor an act of heroism visible to history. It was simply, profoundly, the choice to honor the humanity of another in a moment where cruelty could have reigned. And that choice, quiet yet immense, began to rewrite the story of that morning in the camp forever. The weight of months of suffering pressed down on the prisoners like an unyielding force. Their bodies, gaunt and fragile, were etched with the history of deprivation, ribs protruding beneath tattered clothing, knees bruised and scarred from the harsh ground. and hands roughened and cracked from endless labor and exposure. Every motion carried the ghost of exhaustion, a reminder that they had lived far too long under conditions designed to break them. Yet, amidst the cold mud and relentless rain, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift began to take shape. The words of the Americans, spoken with calm precision and deliberate gentleness, did not merely echo across the camp. They penetrated deep into the prisoners' minds and hearts, coaxing forth a sense of humanity that had long been suppressed. At first, the changes were subtle. A hand that had clutched a blanket tightly, knuckles white from the tension loosened, shoulders rigid and hunched as if to shield themselves from an invisible storm, began to relax. Eyes, previously downcast or tightly shut in anticipation of harm, began to flicker open, scanning the figures of the soldiers with disbelief. The prisoners could hardly trust the gentleness they witnessed. Here were men, armed and fully capable of enforcing fear, yet choosing instead to extend compassion. In that paradox, the women found themselves momentarily disarmed, their long-held instinct for self-protection challenged by the presence of an unexpected mercy. Every word, every gesture carried a quiet power, reminding the women of lives that had existed before the war, of moments where trust and kindness were not punishments but lifelines. It was in the small, almost imperceptible details that the impact of mercy became tangible. A soldier's hand extended in a gesture of reassurance, fingers lightly brushing the air near a prisoner without threatening contact. A measured, steady voice conveyed calm instructions rather than demands, guiding the women with patience they had not known in months. And slowly, the prisoners responded, not all at once, but incrementally, each small action a tentative step back into the fragile domain of hope. Some released the grip on their blankets, allowing them to fall slack against their bodies. Others lifted their heads further, eyes meeting those of the soldiers, searching for confirmation that this was not an illusion, that they were truly being addressed with humanity and care rather than intimidation and force. As these small gestures multiplied across the camp, a ripple of understanding spread between the prisoners. Faces hardened by fear began to soften, and the atmosphere, once saturated with dread, began to shift imperceptibly. Whispers traveled from one prisoner to another, conveying astonishment, relief, and the faint stirrings of gratitude. Mothers dared to glance at their children with less apprehension, and sisters exchanged silent glances that spoke of shared survival rather than impending loss. There was a tentative recognition that, in this space, something profoundly different was happening. The prisoners were not being treated as subhuman, not being reduced to objects of fear, but being acknowledged as individuals capable of thought, feeling, and hope. It was also a test, a fragile negotiation between instinctive fear and cautious trust. The women had endured so many months of neglect, punishment, and humiliation that even the gentlest of words carried a weight of disbelief. Could they truly accept kindness in this place where cruelty had been the norm? The answers came slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the small signs of engagement, the softening of a jawline, the release of tightly held hands, the hesitant but unmistakable lifting of eyes toward those who spoke. Each gesture was a victory over months of learned helplessness, each moment a reclamation of agency that the war had attempted to strip away. In the midst of this transformation, a quiet dialogue of trust and understanding began to emerge. The Americans did not shout or demand, they guided and reassured. The prisoners did not immediately respond with full confidence, they inched toward acknowledgement, piece by piece, like fragile threads being woven into a tapestry of renewed possibility. Time seemed suspended, each interaction pregnant with significance, each gesture resonating far beyond the immediate moment. The prisoners began to internalize a radical truth: that survival was possible not just through endurance, but through the acknowledgement of their humanity by others. The camp, which had previously seemed a place of endless suffering, began to take on a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth. It was not the warmth of sunlight. Clouds still covered the sky, but the warmth of recognition, of a human connection that transcended fear. Mothers allowed themselves to touch their children's shoulders lightly, reassuring them with soft murmurs rather than silent resignation. Young women looked to their companions and smiled faintly, a small, almost imperceptible act of defiance against despair. And the soldiers, fully aware of the delicate balance, continued their deliberate, compassionate approach, offering support in a manner that demanded nothing but allowed everything: safety, dignity, and hope. By the hours passing, the transformation became more visible. The tension that had weighed so heavily over months of captivity began to dissipate incrementally. Prisoners adjusted their postures, standing or sitting with slightly less rigidity, breathing with less restraint. Hands that had clutched at mud blankets or each other in panic now rested lightly, poised for contact but no longer defensive. Faces that had been etched with the pain of hunger, fear, and exposure softened with cautious relief. And in this subtle yet profound evolution, the prisoners began to internalize a fundamental truth. Even in a world governed by violence and destruction, compassion could penetrate like a blade of light cutting through the thick shadows of despair. It was a testament not only to the prisoners' resilience, but also to the quiet power of mercy. Each gesture, each word, each moment of calm authority from the soldiers reaffirmed the fragile yet undeniable fact that human dignity need not be extinguished by circumstance. In this space, fear and hope coexisted in a delicate dance, each pushing and pulling against the other, until the prisoners realized that their captors could choose empathy over cruelty. The realization was transformative, a subtle yet profound victory over months of subjugation. By midday, the camp had shifted from a landscape dominated by despair to a place where the faintest glimmer of hope took root. Some prisoners dared to speak softly to one another, voices trembling yet alive with the faintest echoes of agency and choice. Others dared to glance at the soldiers and offer tentative signs of acknowledgement. A nod, a hesitant smile, or a quiet, questioning look. Each small act was an assertion of existence, a reclamation of the self, and a recognition that the voice of mercy had become more than sound. It had become a lifeline. And though fear remained, woven into every glance and breath, it was now tempered with possibility. The prisoners had endured too much to forget the harsh lessons of cruelty, yet they had also experienced, for the first time in months, a proof that human compassion could exist even in the heart of war. They learned, in a slow and careful process, that trust could grow in unlikely places, that mercy could pierce through despair, and that even amidst the relentless machinery of conflict, moments of profound humanity could emerge. By evening, the change was subtle but undeniable. The prisoners, once rigid and trembling, now moved with a cautious fluidity, their gestures freer, their eyes less clouded with dread. Mothers comforted children with gentle touches rather than fearful restraint. Friends exchanged glances filled with tentative understanding, and even the quietest among the women dared to lift their heads higher breathing in the air that no longer seemed to press so heavily upon them. The camp, though still mud, slick and rain-soaked, had become a place where the presence of mercy had altered the very rhythm of life within it, offering the prisoners a sense of self and hope that had long been denied. In this slow, almost imperceptible transformation, a powerful truth emerged. Compassion, even when small, deliberate, and measured, could reshape an environment steeped in suffering. The prisoners, once immobilized by fear, now began to engage with their surroundings, tentatively reclaiming space and agency that the war had stripped away. And the soldiers, observing with careful restraint, became active participants in this resurrection of spirit, their words and gestures forming the scaffold upon which hope could begin to rebuild itself. The hours that followed carried with them a sense of cautious transformation. The camp, once heavy with the oppressive weight of fear and anticipation, seemed to breathe differently, as though the very air had been altered by the presence of mercy. The Japanese female prisoners, who had spent months on the precipice of despair, began to navigate this fragile new space with a tentative curiosity. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as if the act of existing under the gaze of compassionate captors required recalibration. Their bodies, gaunt and exhausted from weeks of deprivation, began to reflect subtle signs of life, shoulders no longer rigidly hunched, heads lifting slightly, and hands that had been clenched in anxiety now resting loosely at their sides. It was not the exuberance of joy, but the quiet assertion of survival, a claim to humanity that the war had long tried to strip from them. In these early hours, whispers of gratitude began to circulate among the prisoners, soft and almost inaudible at first, but growing in confidence as the day wore on. Mothers murmured comforting words to their children, delicate phrases meant to reassure and to anchor both the young and themselves in the fragile reality of mercy. Sisters exchanged tentative smiles, their eyes communicating the shared understanding that the presence of humanity, so long absent, could exist even here in the mud, rain, and desolation of the camp. Some of the younger women, whose faces had long been etched with a mixture of fear and resignation, began to experiment with small acts of agency, brushing mud from their clothing, adjusting a blanket, or reaching out to touch a companion's arm in solidarity. Each gesture was an act of resistance against the psychological weight of imprisonment, a subtle yet powerful reclaiming of identity in a world that had sought to erase it. The Americans, fully aware of the delicate balance they were navigating, continued to exercise deliberate patience. They did not force interaction or attempt to impose comfort through overt gestures. Instead, they allowed the prisoners to respond on their own terms, speaking in measured tones and maintaining a quiet presence that exuded control without aggression. Their eyes scanned the camp, observing the small changes, the cautious gestures, and the growing recognition that these women, once immobilized by fear, were beginning to reclaim fragments of their strength. In this silent exchange, an unspoken understanding emerged that survival could coexist with dignity, that mercy could exist even amid the machinery of war, and that human connection, however fragile, could take root in the most unlikely of places. As the day progressed, the transformation became more pronounced. The prisoners, once frozen by fear, began to speak softly to one another, sharing observations, reassurances, and even questions about the soldiers' intentions. These conversations were delicate, careful explorations into trust, yet they carried within them the seeds of hope. Mothers encouraged their children to eat small portions of the food provided, guiding them with gentle hands and words that communicated safety rather than panic. Sisters and friends exchanged glances that conveyed recognition of a shared experience, a mutual acknowledgement that they were witnessing, and perhaps even participating in, the slow restoration of their own agency. The prisoners were, in essence, rediscovering themselves, piece by piece, through the gentle, deliberate presence of mercy. It was a day in which silence held as much weight as speech. The prisoners listened intently to the cadence of the soldiers' voices, noting the deliberate absence of threat and the quiet patience that permeated each instruction. The sound of mud squelching beneath boots, once a harbinger of dread, became almost rhythmic, a subtle backdrop to the slow unfolding of trust. Eyes that had long avoided contact now tracked movements, registering gestures and responses with a mixture of wariness and cautious optimism. Mothers, sisters, and friends alike began to allow themselves brief glances upward, their faces registering the faintest hints of curiosity and recognition that the world could be navigated safely, at least in this small corner of chaos. Even the physical space of the camp seemed to participate in this shift. The mud, so oppressive and clinging, became a shared reality rather than an insurmountable obstacle. The platforms, rickety and worn, offered moments of respite rather than constant discomfort. The barbed wire, once a symbol of confinement and threat, seemed less menacing when juxtaposed with the calm, deliberate movements of the Americans. Each prisoner began to perceive the camp not solely as a prison, but as a fragile arena in which mercy could assert itself, moment by moment, word by word, gesture by gesture. The slow reclamation of personal space mirrored the internal reclamation of courage, agency, and selfhood that had long been suppressed. The prisoner's resilience became increasingly visible as small actions multiplied. Hands reached out to comfort trembling companions. Mothers adjusted blankets with careful, deliberate movements. Sisters exchanged words and smiles of encouragement. Even those who had been silent, frozen in fear for weeks or months, began to exhibit subtle signs of engagement, a head lifted, a hand brushing mud from a sleeve, a tentative glance toward the approaching soldiers. These seemingly minor acts represented monumental internal victories, signaling that the human spirit, even when battered by suffering, could respond to mercy and compassion with its own assertion of life. In these fragile hours, a subtle but profound psychological transformation occurred. The prisoners began to internalize a truth that had been long denied, that they were seen, recognized, and treated as human beings rather than objects of fear or targets of punishment. This recognition, however quietly rendered, carried enormous weight. It allowed the prisoners to take tentative control of their own emotional and physical responses, to reclaim a sense of autonomy that the camp and its conditions had systematically stripped away. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word of reassurance was absorbed, catalogued, and slowly integrated into a renewed sense of self, forming the foundation upon which further resilience could be built. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in the camp had subtly but unmistakably shifted. The prisoners moved with more confidence, speaking in hushed tones, but with increasing clarity. Mothers encouraged their children, who were now more willing to eat, move, and even play quietly. Sisters and friends engaged in cautious exchanges that communicated hope and solidarity. The soldiers, fully attuned to the delicate nature of this transformation, maintained their calm, controlled presence, allowing the prisoners to dictate the pace of interaction. It was a quiet choreography of trust, patience, and recognition unfolding in real time, yet charged with monumental emotional weight. The prisoners began to understand, on a deep and almost instinctual level, that survival was no longer solely a matter of enduring punishment or evading harm. Instead, it was also about engaging with a world in which mercy could exist, and recognizing that their own humanity had value and meaning, even here. This realization manifested in small, tangible ways: a hand extended to steady a stumbling companion, a soft word offered to reassure a frightened child, an exchange of glance or smile that communicated solidarity. Each action, no matter how modest, was a testament to the power of human compassion to transform fear into cautious optimism. As evening approached, the camp, still mud-slick and rain-soaked, radiated a quiet, almost imperceptible energy of renewal. The prisoners, once immobilized by dread, now moved with purpose tempered by caution. Their faces, previously etched with despair, displayed subtle signs of recognition, relief, and even faint hope. Mothers held children with calm assurance, sisters supported one another, and friends engaged in quiet, meaningful exchanges that reinforced a growing sense of agency. In this space, the prisoners learned that even amid the chaos of war, mercy could take root, offering a fragile yet undeniable lifeline to those who had endured unimaginable suffering. The psychological and emotional transformation of the camp continued into the night, with each small act reinforcing the fragile sense of security and hope that had begun to emerge. Prisoners spoke softly to one another, exchanged gestures of reassurance, and began to reclaim their physical and emotional presence within the camp. The soldiers' careful, deliberate conduct remained a stabilizing force, providing a consistent demonstration that compassion and human dignity could coexist with the responsibilities of military authority. And as the night deepened, the prisoners realized, perhaps for the first time in months, that the presence of mercy had altered the very fabric of their experience. Fear, though still present, was tempered by hope. Despair, once a constant companion, now shared space with cautious optimism. And in the hearts of the prisoners, a recognition took root that survival was no longer a mere act of endurance, but a possibility infused with dignity, agency, and human connection. It was a lesson written not in words on a page, but in the lived reality of each trembling hand, each lifted head, each cautious smile that emerged from the mud, rain, and shadows of the camp.